People think a cruel home is still a home, just because the door has a lock and dinner is on the table. I learned the hard way that a punishment can be louder than any scream, even when no one outside hears it. The night Liora turned 18, the air in Valewick tasted like rain and cold iron. Wind pressed against the windows of her father's house as if it wanted to warn her, but warnings were useless in a place where love was rationed and obedience was worshipped. The old clocks in the hall clicked like accusing tongues. Each sound told her the same truth. You are not safe here, not even under your own roof. Her father, Garen Holt, stood in the lamplight with his sleeves rolled up, not because he planned to work, but because he wanted to be seen as a man who did what was necessary. He was respected in town, sharp suit, charitable smile, a hand always ready to shake another hand. To the world he was discipline and duty. To Liora he was a storm that arrived without thunder, the kind that ruined crops quietly and left the fields looking normal by morning. "You've made us a spectacle," he said, and his voice was calm enough to frighten her more than shouting ever could. "I didn't mean to," Liora whispered. Her palms were damp. She tried to keep her chin steady, the way her mother once taught her before her mother's voice disappeared from the house like a candle snuffed by a draft. "I only wanted to bring the medicine to Mrs. Elen. She can't walk to the apothecary." Garen's eyes flicked toward the small pouch in Leora's hands, as if kindness itself offended him. "You only wanted," he repeated, tasting the words as if they were rotten fruit. "You only wanted people to look at you like you're good." Leora's heart tightened. She knew this script. In his world, compassion was a performance, humility was weakness, and courage was disobedience dressed in a pretty name. He stepped closer, and the lamplight caught the silver ring on his finger, polished, respectable, heavy with power. That ring meant he belonged to a council that kept Valewick pure, a council that spoke in prayers while making bargains in shadows. From the hallway, the maid's footsteps paused, then retreated. In this house, even the walls had learned not to argue. Garen took the pouch from Leora's hands and set it on the table like evidence. He reached beneath the sideboard and drew out a narrow iron collar, old and dark, with a small charm attached, thorn-shaped, engraved with symbols Liora had seen on council doors. Her breath caught. The council used those charms when they wanted to make a lesson out of someone without leaving marks the neighbors could see. "Father, please," she said, and hated the word as it left her mouth, hated how it made her sound small when she felt something inside her trying to stand up. He didn't raise his voice. That was part of his cruelty. "The world needs to understand consequences," he said. "If you insist on playing saint, you can do it where no one applauds you." He fastened the collar around her neck, cold metal against skin. It wasn't painful, not in a way that would make anyone intervene, but it was humiliating, like being named a thing instead of a person. The charm rested against her throat, heavy as a verdict. Leora's fingers rose to it instinctively, and Garen's hand snapped her wrist away with a practiced restraint that looked almost gentle. "You will go to Blackwood Manor," he said. The name made the room shrink. Blackwood Manor sat beyond the last street lamp at the edge of the forest, half swallowed by pines and fog. No child played near it. No one walked past its gates after dusk. It belonged to a legend the town pretended not to believe in, because pretending felt safer than admitting fear. The vampire king," Liora murmured before she could stop herself. Garen's mouth tilted into something that wasn't a smile. "King?" He said it like a joke told by someone holding a knife behind his back. "They call him that because they need a monster to blame for their own hunger. He hasn't taken anyone from Valewick in years." Liora swallowed, the charm biting lightly as her throat moved. "Why send me there?" "Because you need humility," Garen said, and his gaze lowered to the collar, satisfied. "Because you need to learn that kindness does not protect you from consequence, and because if the king truly exists, he will recognize what you are." Her skin went cold in a way the metal couldn't explain. "What I am." Garen didn't answer. He simply opened the front door, and the wind rushed in as if the night had been waiting to claim her. Beyond the porch, a carriage stood, black, plain, unmarked. Its driver kept his head down. Even the horses seemed reluctant, their breath steaming in nervous bursts. Liora stepped outside, every instinct screaming to run, to fight, to do anything but obey. Yet the collar's presence was a constant reminder. Disobedience would be punished in private ways and called love in public. She looked back once, hoping for a flicker of regret in her father's face, something human. There was nothing, just certainty. The ride to Blackwood Manor felt longer than distance should allow. The wheels hissed over wet stone roads. Pine scent thickened. Fog clung to the carriage windows like pale hands. Liora pressed her forehead against the glass, watching Valewick's lights vanish behind her. In their place, darkness, trees, and the soft, unnerving sense that something was watching, not hunting, not rushing, simply aware. When the manor gates appeared, they were not dramatic. They were worse, plain iron, old and quiet, like a promise that had never been broken. The driver did not speak. He only opened the door and gestured with a hand that trembled. Liora's boots sank into damp gravel. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called once, then fell silent. The manor rose ahead, windows dark, the roofline sharp against the clouded moon. A faint light glowed near the entrance, as if someone had left a candle burning and forgotten to blow it out. She walked up the steps, each one stealing warmth from her legs. The charm at her throat seemed heavier with every breath, as if it recognized where she was. At the door, she lifted her hand to knock, then hesitated. In that pause, she heard something she hadn't expected, a sound like a quiet exhale from just beyond the wood, not hostile, not eager, almost tired. The door opened by itself. Warmth spilled out, carrying the scent of old books, cedar, and something faintly sweet like winter apples. The hallway beyond was dim but not filthy or ruined. It looked cared for, as if someone believed even shadows deserved order. Liora stepped inside, and the door shut behind her with a final, gentle click that made her stomach drop. "Liora Holt," a voice said from the darkness, low, controlled, and painfully calm. Her name, spoken as if the speaker had been waiting for her all along, tightened the air in her lungs. She turned toward the sound and saw him at the end of the corridor, half in shadow. He was tall, still, dressed simply in black, his presence heavy not with threat but with attention, like a storm choosing not to break. His eyes caught the candlelight and held it. Not red and theatrical, not monstrous. Just startlingly clear, pale as moonlit glass, and filled with something Liora could not place at first, until she realized it was restraint. The look of someone who had every reason to be cruel and spent his life refusing to be. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Liora's throat tightened around the iron charm. "I didn't choose it." The Vampire King took one slow step forward, and the floor didn't creak beneath him. His gaze dropped to the collar, and something sharp flickered across his face. Anger, yes, but not at her. At whoever had put it there. He stopped a careful distance away, as if he feared his closeness might frighten her. When he spoke again, his voice softened, almost like a vow he didn't want to make too quickly. "That charm," he murmured, "it's not a punishment, it's a message." Liora's fingers rose to the thorn-shaped pendant, and for the first time she noticed the engraving wasn't just a symbol. It was a seal, an invitation written in code. The Vampire King's eyes lifted to meet hers, and the quiet in the manor felt suddenly alive, listening. "Tell me," he said, each word weighed with sorrow, "what did your father promise them in exchange for you?" Liora opened her mouth to answer, but the charm at her throat grew abruptly warm, as if a hidden hand had touched it from far away. The candlelight trembled. Somewhere deep in the manor, a door clicked, one that neither of them had moved to open. And the Vampire King's restraint finally cracked, just enough for fear to show. "They're already here," he whispered. The corridor seemed to narrow as the candlelight wavered, bending toward the sound from deeper inside the manor. Liora's fingers stayed on the charm at her throat, not because it helped, but because it reminded her she was still real. The warmth pulsing through the metal felt like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. The Vampire King moved first, not rushing, not panicking, but with a calm that made the fear in the air look smaller. "Stay behind me," he said, and it wasn't an order spoken to control her. It was a promise spoken to protect her. Liora tried to obey, but her legs were unsteady. "Who is here?" she managed. His gaze didn't leave the shadowed doorway down the hall. "Men who call themselves righteous," he answered, voice low. "They come with prayers on their lips and bargains in their pockets." He lifted his hands slightly, palm open, as if asking the manor itself to be still. The air changed. The cold didn't deepen, but it grew quieter, like snow falling in a world that wants to listen. Liora realized with a strange jolt that he wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was trying to calm her body before it betrayed her with panic. From the dark, footsteps approached. Not many. 2, maybe 3, measured steps, confident enough to suggest they believed they were welcome. A man's voice carried forward. "Your Majesty," it called, smooth as old leather. "Forgive our late hour." Liora flinched at the title. Your Majesty. In Valewick, people spat out vampire like a curse, yet this stranger offered a bow of words as if the king were a host at a formal dinner. The vampire king didn't answer right away. He glanced at Liora once, quickly, as though checking that she was still standing. Then he stepped into fuller candlelight. Now she could see him more clearly. His face was pale but not lifeless, his expression composed but not empty. He wore no crown. Nothing about him screamed royalty, except the way the manor seemed to shape itself around his presence, like the house had learned his silence and chosen to honor it. 3 figures emerged, men in dark coats, boots polished, collars high against the wet night. Their hands were gloved. Their eyes were too bright with purpose. And one of them wore the same thorn-marked symbol stamped into his ring. Leora's stomach turned. "Counsel," she breathed. The middle man, tall, thin, with hair combed perfectly back, smiled as if he'd heard a compliment. "Miss Holt," he said, looking at her with practiced warmth. "You've arrived safely. Good, that saves us trouble." The Vampire King's voice cut through the air like a curtain dropping. "You used her as a key." The councilman's smile softened into something almost pitying. "A key, a gift. Words differ by taste. The charm around her neck was forged to open what you keep locked, Your Majesty." He spread his hands politely. "We came for what is owed." Leora's throat tightened. "Owed?" She turned her head slightly toward the king without fully looking away from the men. "My father said he was teaching me humility." The Vampire King's jaw flexed. "No," he said, and the word held a tenderness that startled her. "He was selling your safety and calling it discipline." The councilman sighed like someone tired of repeating obvious truths. "Valewick needs stability, you know that. And you, Your Majesty, have had your peace for too long. We need the old protections returned." "Protections," the king repeated, and his voice didn't rise, but the candle flame leaned away from him as if it feared the edge beneath his calm. "You mean chains." The councilman's gaze flicked to Leora's collar. "Chains, vows, boundaries, civilization has many names." Leora's hands curled into fists. A hot, humiliating pressure burned behind her eyes. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But the Vampire King was standing between her and them like a wall built from patience. He spoke again, quieter. "Leave now." For a breath, the councilmen hesitated, as if they weren't used to being refused. Then the thin one smiled again, wider this time, almost satisfied. "We expected resistance," he said. "That's why we brought a witness, someone you won't wish to harm." A 4th figure stepped out of the shadows behind them. Liora froze. It was the maid from her father's house, Mara, her eyes wide, her face pale, her hands shaking as if she'd been dragged through fear itself. A councilman held her by the arm, not roughly, but firmly, like she was property. "Mara," Liora whispered, voice cracking. "Why are you here?" Mara's lips trembled. "I tried to follow," she said, barely audible. I didn't want you alone." Leora's chest tightened with a sudden aching gratitude, and then guilt, sharp as a needle. Her kindness had always cost someone else. The Vampire King's eyes changed, not in color but in focus. The compassion in them did not fade. It hardened into something more dangerous, decision. He looked at the councilmen. "You brought her to keep my hands clean." The thin man gave a small bow. "We brought her to keep you reasonable." The king exhaled slowly, as if counting his restraint like rosary beads. When he spoke, the words were steady, but Liora heard the fury he refused to unleash. "You misunderstand what makes me reasonable." Liora couldn't take it anymore. She stepped out from behind him before she could lose her nerve. "If this is about me," she said, voice shaking but loud enough to fill the hall, Then let Mara go. She didn't do anything. The councilman's gaze slid over her like a blade evaluating its next cut. Always offering yourself, he murmured. That's why your father chose you. A girl who walks willingly into cages is easier to trade. Liora's cheeks burned. She hated how true it sounded, hated how her own courage could be twisted into an insult. The vampire king turned his head slightly toward her, and his voice dropped so only she could hear. You don't owe them your bravery, he said. Bravery doesn't mean surrender. I don't know what else to do, Liora whispered back. I can't let them hurt her. His gaze held hers, and in that moment she felt something strange, like he wasn't only seeing her fear. He was seeing her heart, the part of her that still wanted to protect people even when no one protected her. You remind me, he said, so quietly it barely became sound, of someone I failed. Before she could ask what he meant, he faced the council again. You want what I keep locked, he said. Fine, but you will not use her to reach it. The thin man's eyes gleamed. Then you agree to the exchange. The king didn't answer. Instead, he extended his hand, not toward the men, but toward Liora. His palm was open, the gesture almost human in its simplicity. An invitation, not a command. Liora stared at it. Everything in her life had taught her that a powerful man's hand meant control, yet his hand looked like it meant choice. What happens if I take it? She asked, voice unsteady. His eyes softened. Then you won't be alone, he said, and you'll learn the truth your father buried. Behind the councilman, Mara made a small sound, half sob, half plea. The councilman tightened his grip on her arm. Liora's pulse hammered. She wanted to trust the vampire king, but trust was a door she'd only ever opened to be punished. Still, she placed her hand in his. His skin was cool, not dead cold, but like stone in shade. And the instant their fingers met, the thorn charm at her throat flared hot, as if recognizing something it had been built to find. The candlelight in the corridor snapped brighter, then dimmed, as though the manor inhaled sharply. The thin councilman's polite mask finally slipped. There it is, he hissed, the bond. Liora blinked. Bond. The vampire king's grip tightened, gentle, protective. Yet she felt a tremor run through him, like a man bracing for a memory he didn't want. I didn't want this for you, he said. The charm burned like a secret being branded into air, and Liora's mind filled with a sudden, impossible image. A different girl, years ago, wearing the same collar, reaching for the same hand, and the same manor doors closing too late. Liora gasped, yanking her hand back. The connection snapped, but the image remained, trembling at the edges of her sight. The councilman laughed softly. Now you remember, your majesty, now you understand why we came. The vampire king's eyes shut for one brief moment, as if in prayer or regret. When he opened them, there was a quiet grief inside, ancient and unmistakably human. And then from somewhere beneath the manor, something answered the charm's call. A low, resonant sound like a lock turning in the earth. The floor beneath Liora's feet vibrated. Mara cried out. The thin councilman leaned forward, almost eager. Open it, he whispered, or the girl bleeds into the night. The vampire king stepped between them and Liora again, his shoulders squared, his voice softer than ever, soft enough to terrify. No, he said, not this time. But even as he refused, the lock beneath the manor continued to turn, as if Liora's very presence had already begun opening a door no one could close. The vibration under the floorboards grew steadier, like a giant, buried clock beginning to move again. Dust loosened from the ceiling beams and drifted down in slow spirals. The councilmen stood perfectly still, listening with the satisfaction of men who believe the world has finally obeyed them. Liora backed up until her shoulders met the cold wall. The charm at her throat still burned, but now it was joined by something stranger, an ache behind her ribs, as if her heart had been tugged toward the sound below. The vampire king lifted his hand, palm down, and the manor answered him. The trembling dulled, not stopped but softened, like a beast lowering its head when it recognizes its keeper. His control wasn't loud. It was intimate, practiced, and full of mercy. Everyone stays where they are, he said. It wasn't a threat, yet it carried weight. This house has been a sanctuary longer than your council has had a name. The thin councilman gave a humorless smile. A sanctuary built over a vault. We didn't come for your furniture, your majesty. We came for what you buried. The king's gaze held steady. I buried it because it cannot be owned, and because power without humility turns holy men into monsters. At the word monsters, the councilman's eyes flicked to Liora. Interesting you say that while sheltering a girl your kind would once have fed upon. A cold silence followed. Liora felt it, how close the accusation landed to the stories she'd been taught as a child. She had been raised on warnings: never wander at night, never meet the eyes of the immortal, never accept a vampire's kindness because it's only a trap. And yet the king had stepped in front of her, again and again, without asking her for anything in return. Liora drew a shaky breath. If the collar is a key, she said, forcing her voice to work, then take it off, break it, throw it into the fire. The king's eyes softened with something that looked like pain. I can't, he admitted, not safely. Why not? His gaze fell to the thorn charm. Because it's not only iron, he said quietly. It's an oath woven with intention. Whoever forged it tied it to you. The thin councilman tilted his head. And tied her to you. Leora's stomach tightened. I don't understand. The king looked at her as if weighing how much truth her heart could carry at once. Your father didn't just send you here to be punished, he said. He sent you because you are compatible with the lock. Your bloodline is old. Leora's mouth went dry. My bloodline. A memory surfaced without warning. Her mother brushing her hair by the hearth, whispering, you have a brave heart, little star. Never let them tell you it's a sin. Then her mother's hands shaking as voices rose downstairs. Then the council's emblem stamped in wax on a letter she was never allowed to read. The king's expression tightened, like he'd recognized the same missing pieces long ago. The council needed a vessel, he said. Someone who could open what they can't open themselves. The councilman's smile returned, thin and satisfied. A girl with the right heritage and the right temperament. She brings herself to the altar and calls it kindness. Truly, the world provides. Leora's cheeks burned with shame and anger, not because she believed him, but because she recognized the way her father had used her good instincts against her, turning her compassion into a leash. Mara trembled in the councilman's grip. Please, she begged. Miss Liora, don't listen. He's lying to make you afraid. The thin councilman's hand tightened on Mara's arm. Quiet. The king's eyes flashed, not with hunger, but with a protective rage he kept caged behind discipline. He took one step forward. The candle flames all along the hall leaned toward him, as if gravity itself had changed. Let her go, the king said. The councilman smirked. Or what? You'll be the monster the town already thinks you are. The king did not move again. His stillness was more frightening than motion, like the pause before a judge speaks. Or I will become something the town has never seen from me, he said calmly, and neither will you. Liora swallowed hard. She realized in a sudden rush that the king had built his entire reign on restraint. Not because he was weak, because he was strong enough to refuse the easiest path. The floor tremor surged again, stronger this time, and a seam appeared in the hallway carpet. No, not a seam. A fine line in the wood itself, like a door drawn in invisible ink. The thin councilman inhaled as if smelling victory. There, he whispered, it's opening. Leora's charm flared so hot she cried out. She clutched her throat, knees buckling. The air tasted metallic again, and the manor's warmth seemed to drain toward the floor. The king was at her side instantly, not touching her collar, only bracing her shoulders so she wouldn't fall. Breathe with me, he murmured. Slow, you're safe. Safe, the word almost shattered her because it was so rare. I'm sorry, Liora gasped. I didn't mean. I know, he said, and there was no blame in his eyes. They built this to force you. The thin councilman lifted his hand and pressed 2 fingers to the emblem ring at his own hand, as if sending a signal. From somewhere outside, distant and muffled by stone and forest, horns answered. soft, careful sounds, like men positioning themselves around the estate. They'd come prepared. They'd come to take the manor apart. The king's gaze lifted, distant for a heartbeat. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, older. "This is why I lived in shadow," he said. "Not because I feared the sun, because I feared what men would do with what I guarded." Liora forced herself upright. "What is it?" she whispered. He met her eyes. "A fountain," he said. "Not of blood, of memory, of grief, of vows that refuse to die. The first king of my line bound it beneath this house so no one would use it to rewrite what they've done." The councilman's expression sharpened. "We will use it to cleanse Valewick." "To erase," the king corrected. "To forget your own cruelty." The thin councilman shrugged. "People deserve peace." "They deserve truth," the king said. Then he turned to Liora and lowered his voice. "There is a way to stop the door from opening, but it asks something difficult from you." Leora's heart hammered. "What?" He hesitated. The hesitation itself frightened her more than the councilmen did. "It asks you to choose," he said. "Not obedience, not sacrifice because you were trained to surrender, a real choice." The charm pulsed, demanding. The door line in the floor widened, a whisper of cold rising from below like breath from a deep cave. "If you keep the collar on," the king said, "the lock will recognize you and open fully. If you remove it, the reaction could hurt you." "Hurt me how?" He swallowed, the first time she'd seen him look uncertain. "Like losing a piece of yourself you didn't know was tied up in it." Liora stared at him, realizing the cruelest twist. Even her punishment had been designed so the path to freedom would still cost her. Mara sobbed again. "Miss Liora, please." The thin councilman leaned close to Mara's ear, smiling as if he were comforting her. "Don't plead," he murmured. "It's inevitable." Leora's hands rose to the collar clasp. Her fingers shook so hard she couldn't find the latch. The king covered her hands with his, guiding gently, never forcing. "Look at me," he said softly. She did. His eyes were moon-clear, filled with restraint and sorrow and something deeper, devotion that didn't demand worship. "You do not exist to be traded," he told her. "You are not a key, you are a person. Whatever happens next, I will not let them turn your kindness into a weapon against you." For the first time in her life, Liora believed a powerful man's promise. She found the latch. The iron was warm now, almost alive. She pulled. The collar snapped open with a sharp click that echoed down the corridor like a bell. The burn vanished. Liora sucked in a ragged breath, dizzy with relief. For a second she thought it had worked. The tremor faded. The door line in the floor began to close, the wood knitting back together as if the manor itself were healing. The thin councilman's smile faltered. "No," he hissed. Then the charm, still hanging from Leora's fingers, flared bright and emitted a thin, crystalline tone like glass singing. It wasn't a lock releasing. It was a signal. From beneath the manor, the turning sound became a asterisk thud asterisk, final, decisive. The hidden door did not close. It opened. Cold air rushed up, not hostile but heavy with old sorrow. The candle flames bowed low. The manor seemed to mourn. And from the black opening in the floor, a voice rose, soft, ancient, and intimately familiar to Leora's bones. "Child of my blood," it whispered, "at last." Liora staggered back, eyes wide. "That's impossible," she breathed, because she had never known her mother's family, never known their names. The vampire king's face drained of what little color it held. He stared at the opening like a man facing a grave he'd sworn never to visit. "That voice," he said, barely audible, "belongs to the one who forged the collar." The councilmen leaned forward as the cold wind climbed the walls like smoke. And Liora, shaking, realized the worst truth of all. Her father hadn't sent her to be punished. He had sent her to be claimed. The darkness in the open floor didn't look empty anymore. It looked inhabited, by silence, by memory, by something patient and waiting. A staircase revealed itself, stone steps descending into a chamber that felt older than the manor above it. The thin councilman released Mara not out of kindness, but because his hands were trembling with anticipation. Mara stumbled toward Liora, eyes wet. Liora caught her, steadying her, even while her own legs threatened to give out. The vampire king didn't move to descend. His body was rigid with an emotion Liora hadn't seen yet, fear, not of death, but of repeating something he once failed to stop. "Stay up here," he said to Liora and Mara, voice strained. Leora's head snapped toward him. "No," she whispered, "you told me I would not be alone." His gaze flickered. "I meant it," he said, "but what's down there?" "Is calling me asterisk," Liora finished, voice breaking. "So I'm going." Mara grabbed Leora's sleeve. "Miss, don't, please." Liora turned to her, swallowing panic. "Go to the front room," she said gently. "Lock the door. If I don't come back, run to the village and don't stop. Tell them the council, tell them the truth." Mara shook her head frantically. "They won't listen." Leora's eyes hardened. "Then tell someone who will." The king watched her in silence, something like respect softening the line of his mouth. "Courage," he said quietly, "is not the absence of fear. It's choosing what you love more than what you fear." Liora nodded once, then stepped toward the opening. The councilmen followed with the hunger of men who believed the world was finally about to rewrite itself for their comfort. They kept a careful distance from the king, as if they feared his calm more than his claws. Down the steps the air changed. It smelled of stone and cedar resin, and under it, a faint sweetness like dried flowers preserved between pages of a book. The chamber below was wide and circular, lit by a pale glow rising from a pool at its center. It was not a fountain of blood. It was water, clear, still, reflective as glass. And around the pool, carved into the stone, were names. Hundreds of them, some worn down by time, some sharp and new. Liora stepped closer, drawn. The water reflected her face, and then behind her reflection a second face appeared, a woman with dark hair and familiar eyes. Leora's breath caught. "Mother." The reflection didn't smile, it looked sad. The voice came again, now from everywhere. "Not your mother," it whispered. "Your mother was only the last brave one who refused me." The vampire king moved between Liora and the pool like an instinct he didn't have to think about. "Enough," he said, and the single word carried centuries. The water rippled. A figure rose from it, not climbing out like a creature, but forming the way fog forms into a shape. A woman in an old-fashioned dress, her presence elegant and cold, as if grief had taught her manners. "My name was Seraphine," she said, and her gaze fixed on Liora with hungry familiarity. "Your ancestor, the first of your line to bind a human family to my vow." Leora's throat tightened. "Why are you calling me blood like it's a chain?" Seraphine's lips curved. "Because it is," she said softly. "Your family has always been useful. You open doors, you carry devotion easily, you make yourself small and call it goodness." The words hit like slaps made of truth twisted into cruelty. Leora's eyes stung. She looked at the king, desperate. "Is she real?" The king's jaw clenched. "She is a memory made stubborn," he said. "A will that refused to die. This fountain remembers what we try to bury." The thin councilman stepped forward, practically trembling. "Lady Seraphine," he said with reverence, "we came to restore the old covenant. Give us what the town needs. Take the girl, bind the king, and cleanse Valewick." Seraphine's gaze shifted to him, amused. "Men always want cleansing," she murmured, "because it sounds holier than control." She drifted closer to Liora, and the temperature dropped a fraction. "Child," she whispered, "you can end your pain, you can make your father kneel, you can make the town love you for your goodness. All you must do is accept my vow." Leora's heartbeat roared in her ears. For a moment, just a moment, the offer glittered. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted relief asterisk. She wanted to stop being afraid in her own life. The king's voice came steady at her side. "That relief is a trap," he said. "It will cost you your name." Seraphine smiled. "Oh, my king," she purred, still pretending restraint is virtue when it is also fear. The king's eyes did not flinch. "Restraint is what kept me from becoming you." Liora stared at the pool. The carved names around it seemed to hum faintly, as if each one was a story trapped under stone. She knelt and traced a name half erased by time, then another, some human, some not. "Are these," she whispered. "Those who were bound," the king said softly. "Those who paid to keep the world forgetful." Leora's chest tightened. She stood, turning to Seraphine with sudden clarity. "My father put that collar on me to make me a tool," she said, "and you're offering me power to make me a tool with prettier words." Seraphine's expression sharpened. "I'm offering you purpose." "I already have purpose," Liora said, voice trembling but firm. "To choose kindness even when it costs me, but I will not let you turn that into a cage." For the first time, Seraphine looked irritated. "Then you will remain fragile," she hissed, and the pool's surface darkened. The chamber filled with a pressure like a storm gathering. The councilmen stepped back uneasily, their faith suddenly less confident. The king moved closer to Liora, speaking low. "The fountain responds to choice," he said. "If you reject her vow completely, it may seal again, but it requires truth out loud." Liora swallowed. "What truth?" The king's eyes held hers. "The truth you were never allowed to say in that house," he whispered, "that your father's love was not love." The words lodged in her throat like thorns. Saying them felt like betrayal of the last fragile thread connecting her to family, to normal life, to the hope that maybe she'd imagined it all. Seraphine's voice turned honey smooth. "Don't," she coaxed. "You'll be alone again." The king's voice, by contrast, was quiet and steady. "You won't," he promised. Liora drew in a shaking breath and faced the pool, as if it were a witness that could not lie. "My father's punishment was cruelty," she said, voice cracking. "His discipline was not love, it was control, and I will not carry his shame anymore." The pool flashed pale light, like moonlight hitting ice. The carved names brightened for an instant. Seraphine's face tightened with fury. "Then you choose pain," she snapped. "No," Liora said, tears spilling now, but her spine straight. "I choose myself." The pressure in the room shifted, like a weight being lifted. The pool's surface stilled. The councilmen looked at one another, alarmed. The thin one stepped forward again, desperation sharpening him. "No," he barked. "You can't let it close, we need." He lunged toward Liora. The king moved, not with savagery, but with speed so clean it looked like grace. He caught the councilman's wrist and held him immobile. His voice was cold, controlled. "You will not touch her." The councilman's face contorted. "You're nothing without the fountain." The king leaned in, eyes like winter glass. "Then watch me be nothing," he said. Seraphine's laughter rang through the chamber. "Beautiful," she said. "Your devotion makes you predictable, my king." And then she did something no one expected. She turned her gaze on Mara, who had followed down despite fear, standing at the stairwell with her hands over her mouth. Seraphine smiled gently. "Little servant," she said, "so loyal, so easy to break." Mara gasped, stepping back. Leora's blood ran cold. "Leave her alone." Seraphine's voice turned soft and deadly. "Choose, child. If you won't accept my vow, then offer me another who will, or watch your compassion become the weapon that destroys you." The chamber's light dimmed, and Liora realized the twist in the trap. Seraphine couldn't force her. She could only make Liora believe sacrifice was the only kind of love she deserved. Leora's mind raced, searching for a third path the way a drowning person searches for air. The old patterns in her body screamed at her to give in, to offer herself, to offer anything, because that was how she'd survived her father's house. By paying, by apologizing, by shrinking. But the king's hand touched her shoulder, light and grounding, as if reminding her, "You are not a payment." "Look at me," he said again, and his voice was steady enough to borrow strength from. Liora turned her head. The king's expression was fierce in a quiet way, like a lantern refusing to go out in wind. "Seraphine feeds on coercion," he said. "She cannot take what is freely refused by a whole heart." "Then what do I do?" Liora whispered, trembling. He looked past her at the pool, then at the names carved in stone. "The fountain remembers vows," he said. But it also remembers releases. If you can name the pattern, if you can break the logic of sacrifice, she loses her grip. Mara stood frozen near the stairs, tears shining on her cheeks. "Miss Liora," she whispered, "I'm sorry, I should have run, I didn't want you to be alone." Leora's heart clenched. She took a slow step toward Mara, keeping her body between the servant girl and Seraphine's presence. "You're not the reason I'm here," Liora said, voice shaking. "And you're not the price for my freedom." Seraphine's eyes narrowed. "Pretty words," she purred, "but you will still choose, you always do." The thin councilman, still restrained by the king, hissed through clenched teeth. "Take the vow, fix the town, do something useful for once." Liora flinched at the familiarity of the command. It sounded like her father, like every moment she'd been told her worth was measured by obedience. She inhaled, tasting cold stone and cedar. Then she did the bravest, simplest thing she'd ever done. She spoke to Mara not as a mistress to a servant, but as one human to another. "Mara," she said, "will you trust me?" Mara's eyes widened. "Yes," she whispered, voice breaking. Liora nodded, then turned to the king. "And will you trust me?" she asked. Something moved across his face, hope and fear of hope. "With everything I am," he said. Liora stepped to the pool's edge. The water reflected her again, but now Seraphine's face hovered in it like an unwanted thought. "I refuse your vow," Liora said clearly. "And I refuse your bargain. I refuse the idea that love must be proven by sacrifice." Seraphine's expression twisted. The air thickened as if the chamber wanted to resist. Liora continued, louder, forcing the truth through her shaking body. "I refuse my father's lesson. I refuse the council's lesson. I refuse the story that power belongs to the cruel." The names around the fountain glimmered faintly, one by one, like candles remembered. The king's voice joined hers, quiet but firm. "And I refuse the lie that I am only hunger," he said. "I have lived on restraint, on conscience, on the slow work of choosing mercy. I will not be used to erase anyone's pain." Seraphine laughed, sharp as breaking ice. "Then watch what your mercy costs." The chamber's pressure surged toward Mara like a wind with intention. Mara cried out, clutching her chest, collapsing to her knees. Leora's body lurched forward instinctively. But the king caught her wrist, not to stop her from helping, but to keep her from falling into Seraphine's trap of trade yourself for her asterisk. "There," Seraphine whispered. "Do it, offer yourself, seal the vow with your bloodline, save the girl." Leora's whole life screamed at her to comply. Instead, she knelt beside Mara and placed her hands over Mara's trembling ones. "Breathe," she said softly. "Stay with me." Mara's eyes fluttered. "It hurts," she choked. "I know," Liora whispered, tears spilling. "But you are not alone, you are not a bargaining chip." The king stepped to the pool and did something Liora hadn't expected. He lowered himself to one knee, not in submission to Seraphine, but in humility before the names carved in stone. "To those bound," he said, voice low and reverent, "I ask forgiveness, and I ask permission." He pressed his palm to the stone rim. The light in the chamber steadied, no longer pulled toward Seraphine's will. Seraphine's eyes widened, suddenly wary. "No," she said, "you cannot call them, they are mine." "They were never yours," the king replied. A warmth spread through the chamber, not hot, not consuming, gentle, like sunrise reaching a cold room. Liora felt it in her chest, and Mara's breathing eased slightly, as if the pressure had loosened. The pool shimmered and faint shapes appeared in the reflection, faces not detailed but present, not ghosts hunting, memories witnessing. The names brightened, and for a moment Liora understood this place did not exist to grant power. It existed to keep accountability alive, to keep truth from being buried. Seraphine's voice sharpened with panic. "Stop, stop this." The thin councilman struggled against the king's restraint. "What are you doing? We need the cleansing." Liora looked up at him, her tears drying into something firmer. "You don't want cleansing," she said, voice steady now. "You want permission to keep hurting people and call it order." The councilman spat back. "And what will you call your king, savior?" The king turned his head slightly, his voice quiet. "No," he said, I will be called accountable." Seraphine shrieked, and the pool's surface went dark for a heartbeat, then flashed bright, as if rejecting her shadow. The chamber filled with a sound like 1,000 pages turning at once. The names around the fountain changed. Some faded, released. Others remained, chosen, not imposed. Seraphine stumbled back, her shape flickering, no longer elegant. "You're undoing me," she hissed. Liora stood, shaking but upright. "No," she said, "I'm ending you." Seraphine's eyes snapped to Liora, hatred and longing tangled together. "You will regret this," she whispered. "When the town turns on you, when your father calls you ungrateful, when you discover kindness does not keep you warm." Leora's voice softened, but it didn't break. "Then I will be cold," she said, "and still kind, because my kindness is mine." The pool surged once, water lifting in a smooth column, then falling back with a sound like a deep sigh. The stone seam at the top of the stairs trembled. The king rose, stepping beside Liora. "Now," he said. Liora grabbed Mara's hand. The three of them began backing toward the staircase, while the councilmen stared in shock, suddenly uncertain whether they were losing or simply witnessing something they didn't understand. Seraphine's form thinned, unraveling into mist, but as she faded, her voice slithered after them, sharp and intimate. "The collar was not only a key," she whispered. "It was a asterisk betrothal." Liora froze mid-step. "What?" The king's body went still. His eyes shut, pain crossing his face as if an old wound had been pressed. Seraphine's last words echoed through the chamber like a curse dressed as tradition. "Your devotion will bind you, my king, and she will pay the price." The stairwell shook. The hidden door began to close, fast. And the councilmen, realizing they were about to be sealed inside or locked out, rushed forward at once. The stone seam at the top of the stairs narrowed like a mouth closing. The councilmen surged toward it, shouting over one another, their polished composure cracking into raw panic. "Stop it," the thin one cried. "Open it." The vampire king pivoted, placing himself between them and Liora with the same steady instinct he'd shown all night. He didn't strike. He didn't snarl. He simply raised one hand, palm outward, an unglamorous gesture of refusal. "This is the consequence you always demanded for others," he said. "Now you will live with it." The air thickened in front of him, not as a magical blast, but like the manor itself choosing to enforce a boundary. The councilmen hit that invisible resistance and staggered back, shocked. Liora clung to Myra, pulling her up the stairs. Her lungs burned. Her mind burned worse. "A betrothal." The word echoed inside her like a bell she couldn't unhear. At the top of the stairs, the corridor candlelight swayed wildly. The main hallway felt suddenly far away, like the manor had stretched to keep them safe. Behind them, the stone door continued to close, grinding slowly, relentlessly. They reached the corridor just as the seam snapped shut with a final, deep thud. Silence fell. Not peaceful silence, new silence, the kind that follows a storm when you're counting what survived. Liora leaned against the wall, chest heaving. Mara slid down to the floor, sobbing with relief, her face in her hands. The vampire king stood near the sealed place, motionless, listening as if he could still hear the councilmen trapped below, or the echo of Seraphine's last threat. Leora's fingers rose to her bare throat. The iron collar was gone, but she could still feel its memory, like a shadow on skin. "What did she mean?" Liora asked. Her voice sounded smaller than she wanted. "Betrothal to who?" The king didn't answer immediately. He turned toward her slowly, as if turning too fast might shatter something fragile. "To me," he said at last. The words landed between them with a terrible gentleness. Liora stared at him. "No," she whispered. "That can't be real. I never agreed to anything." "You didn't," he said quickly. And then, with a humility that surprised her again, he bowed his head slightly, not as royalty, but as a man ashamed of a system he inherited. "That is exactly why it is evil." He took a careful step closer, stopping at the same respectful distance as before. "Seraphine used vows to turn people into property," he said. The collar was meant to bind your bloodline to my throne, to make my devotion automatic, not chosen, not earned. Leora's stomach turned. Her father, the council, an ancient voice in the fountain, all of them pulling strings around her life, trying to decide what she would become. Mara looked up through tears. "Miss Liora," she whispered, "does that mean you have to stay here?" Liora didn't know. She hated not knowing. The king's eyes softened toward Mara. "No one has to stay anywhere," he said. "Not anymore." He looked back at Liora. "If any bond exists, I will break it," he promised. "Even if it costs me my crown, even if it costs me my life's work of restraint, because your freedom matters more than my legacy." Those words hit Liora harder than fear had. Her father had always demanded loyalty as proof. This king offered sacrifice as apology, and still spoke as if it were the obvious moral choice. Leora's throat tightened. "Why?" she asked, almost angry. "Why would you give up everything for a girl you met tonight?" The king's gaze dropped for a moment, and when it lifted, it carried a grief so old it felt like it belonged to the stones. "Because I once let a girl be used as a key," he said. "I told myself I was protecting the world by staying distant, by staying controlled, and she paid the price for my hesitation." He exhaled, steadying himself. "I will not repeat that failure, not with you." A quiet settled over Leora's heart, not peace, but a new kind of strength. The strength of being believed, being protected without being owned. Outside, dawn began to thin the darkness at the windows, turning the fog a pale gray. The manor didn't feel like a monster's lair now. It felt like a refuge built by someone who understood how easily power becomes cruelty, and how hard it is to choose better. Liora wiped her cheeks. "Then teach me," she said softly. The king blinked. "Teach you what?" "How to make choices that are mine," Liora said. "How to be kind without being controlled, how to be brave without becoming hard." For the first time, the king's expression looked like relief, quiet, disbelieving relief. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." Mara drew a shaky breath. "And me?" she asked, small. Liora reached for her hand. "You come with me," she said. "Not because you owe me, because I want you safe." The king nodded once, as if sealing the new rule of this house. No one traded, no one trapped, no one left alone. But the world outside Blackwood Manor was still Valewick, still full of polite smiles and hidden knives. Liora knew her father would not accept losing control. The council would not accept losing their cleansing. They would return with better lies. As if answering that thought, a sharp knock sounded at the manor's front door. One knock, then another, measured, confident, familiar. The king's head turned toward it, his posture tightening. Liora felt her pulse jump. From the other side of the door, her father's voice carried in. Calm, respectable, the voice Valewick trusted. "Liora," Garen called gently, as if asking her to come home for supper. "Open the door, we need to talk." Leora's skin went cold, but she didn't step back this time. She stepped forward, standing beside the vampire king instead of behind him. The king glanced at her, silently offering the choice again. Liora placed her hand on the door's iron latch, feeling the chill of it under her palm, feeling the weight of every old pattern that wanted to drag her back into obedience. Behind her, Myra stood trembling but upright. The king's voice was quiet. "Whatever you choose," he said, "I will not let them take you." Liora inhaled, tasting dawn and cedar and the first edge of freedom. Then she began to open the door, just enough to face the man who had always called cruelty love, and to find out whether her new courage would hold when the old world tried to reclaim her.